Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political, economy, and people-to-people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Be sure to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. We count on your support. Today, we have a brief conversation with political commentator and host of the Silk and Steel podcast, Carl Zha. We discuss the long trajectory of China's socialist development, struggles within the Communist Party of China, as well as the US's attempts so far to contain China's development trajectory. In addition to whichever platform you're watching or listening to this on, you can follow the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review as it helps get this program to new listeners. Okay, here's my conversation with Carl. Okay, Carl, welcome to the International Solidarity Pod. Thank you again for being here. Yeah, I know my lighting today isn't as great as it usually is, but we'll have to bear with it. I wanted to start by asking you, um, maybe I have two questions for you here, but let's start off with this. So, when people think about, China and China's development, they largely and especially in terms of socialism and socialist development, they're thinking of 2 points in time. They're thinking of 1949 and they're thinking of 1978, the reform and opening up, and that's sort of pretty much it. Many would argue that now 2014 is another sort of era where there's been a direction shift in the trajectory of Chinese development under, they in China they call it the new era under Xi Jinping. Um, so, well, maybe first of all, I want to ask you if you agree with that framing. And if you do, what is it that sort of drove that shift? There are those who would argue that it's Xi Jinping himself, his experience in the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, that kind of thing, sort of his emphasis on revitalizing the rural sectors. Others would argue that, the 2000s saw, a lot of workers' struggles, workers' strikes, and protests. There's also, yeah, the 2008 financial crisis that sort of signaled to China that, maybe the export led orientation of development is not as sustainable. Um, I put these things on the table here. How do you see this shift in 2014? What is explaining it, if it is indeed a shift?
Okay, so obviously China has gone through very different phases of development. Back in 1949, the main emphasis was how to build a socialist economy in a country that's just emerged out of a century of colonialism and thousands of years of feudalism. And back then the model was to copy USSR. And this is why there was a big push for collectivization in the 1950s and nationalizing all the industries also in the 50s. Now in 1978, as the end of the Cultural Revolution happened, China emerged as a really poor country compared to even its neighbors. In fact, compared to most of the countries in the world. I remember at the time, I think in East Asia, the only country that were poorer than China was Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and that's because those three countries just emerged out of decade-long struggle of anti-colonial wars. And so the at that time, the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping said, you know, the job of if we cannot provide our people with decent living, then we're not building successful socialism. Being poor is not socialism. And we have to demonstrate our system superiority by performing better than the other countries, than the capitalist countries. Only then we can demonstrate the superiority of socialism. This is when they decide to introduce the market economy to bring it into the mix, to introduce competition. And One way that was done was by opening the market to overseas Chinese capital. There are a lot of Chinese population in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Southeast Asia. Once the restrictions were lifted on travel, many of them are welcome to invest in their hometown. So this is the first wave of direct foreign investment into China. It's this brought back by the overseas Chinese population. And then in the 2000, actually in 19 around 1997, was a time when there was a big shift. Before 1997, almost most of the major I, most of the economy is still very state controlled, right? In the 70s and 80s, they let entrepreneur to open up their small businesses, but even so, like the big businesses are still state controlled. So in 1997, um, this this was the time of the Asian financial crisis. That also triggers the 1998 crisis that hit Russia very hard, and China was also forced with reform because as other economies in the neighborhood start crumbling, what they decide to do is to push for a major wave of privatization. So they decide to let um, privatize all the small and medium state-owned enterprises. So the Chinese state will retain control of what they identify as the pillar industries. You know, the commanding heights of the economy. So we're talking. So they retain control over like oil, for example, petrochemicals, energy, electricity, of course, and railway. But they freed up a lot of other industries to allow them to freely compete in the market economy. That was one of the first drastic change. A lot of people lost their job during the transition. It was very hard times for a lot of state-owned enterprise workers who are suddenly find themselves have to compete in a market economy. Many of them were laid off, and it particularly hit northeastern part of China particularly hard because northeast China is like the Rust Belt. And then came 2000, early 2000. That's when China applied to join WTO, and the reason were multifold. One is prior to 2001, every year China's trading status, most favorite nation trading status was up for review in U.S. Congress, and then every time that turns into like a China bashing session. And even though the MFN status keep on getting renewed, but China see that's not sustainable, and so they wanted to shortcut that by joining the World Trade Organization. And when uh, when that and there was a lot of interest also in the West, particularly in the United States, a lot of multinationals who are also wanted to do business in China because they saw China both as a place with huge, vast pool of cheap labor, but also as a potential large market. And so that brought China into the WTO, and then there was a second wave of foreign direct investment into China. A lot of so whereas before in the 80s and 90s, mostly overseas Chinese capital, by 2000, a lot of foreign multinationals start to rushing into China. Now, but for China, their purpose has always been to develop their own capabilities. People may have heard of the term import substitution, because I remember in the 1980s when I lived in China. By the way, I grew up in China. I was born in 1976 after 1 month after Mao died, and I spent the entire decade of 80s growing up in China. During that time, China almost functioned like any other emerging economy, which means it was exporting raw commodities. In the 1980s, China was an net oil exporter. It exported crude oil to Japan and in receiving refine petrochemicals back because China didn't have the refining capability to make its own fertilizer from the crude oil that China produced. So China was exporting agricultural raw commodities and receiving back manufactured goods. And I remember everything of like from transistor radio to TV to refrigerator had to be imported because my dad came to United States to study for his PhD in 1985 because at that time Deng Xiaoping said we should send our students out abroad to learn the advanced technology and expertise from the advanced Western economies. Most of them probably never come back, but even if 20% or a small percentage of them do come back, that's a net plus for us. So I remember at that time my dad would send remittance back home, and that would allow us to buy TV refrigerators, and they were all imported. We bought like Japanese color TV and Japanese refrigerators, not because we're not patriotic Chinese citizens, but because China didn't produce refrigerators in the early 1980s. And China only started to produce refrigerator in 1986. Um, and they didn't mass produce color TV much later. So China had to kind of gain the knowledge to how to make those things for themselves. And this is one of the reasons that welcome the foreign capital investment into China. Whereas for the perspectives of foreign multinationals, they just want to leverage cheap Chinese labor to produce for export to back to their home market to do it like a labor arbitrage. And but from the Chinese perspective, they always had an eye aiming to climb the tech tree, because they want to not just they don't want to be permanently making shoes for Nikes or even just making iPhones. Um, they wanted to make consumer goods first of all for themselves, so they don't have to import anymore. And then after that's achieved, then they make it for export. So that was done very successfully when after Chinese entry into WTO in the 2000. Pretty soon, I remember when I first came to United States in 1990, it's still relatively rare to see made in China goods, but in just few years, all that changed. And then in the two, so what happened is China then went through this like very steady growth period. This is the 2000 era you're talking about. When there's a lot of foreign capital coming in, but there's also a lot of dislocation because a lot of particularly mass migrant labor leaving the countryside to go into coastal cities to work in factories. And there's a lot of social upheaval. So when 2010 come around, Xi Jinping, I think he assumed power around 2012. At that time, China has already built a solid base of industries. China has already industrialized by 2010s, and it has achieved a level of it was no longer like a desperately poor country was in 1980s. And that's when they realized they kind of need to address the government need to realize they need to address the imbalance in the society where there's very little was given back to the rural the rural countryside where a lot of people still resides, by the way. Like in the 1980s, 80% of the people live in the countryside as farmers. That number has shifted, but it's even in the 2010s, I think over half of the population were still living in the countryside. So one of the urgent problem was how to redistribute the wealth, so to speak, because at that time most of the industry was concentrated along the coastal strip for people for the factories that's making the export economy, and then the central government did several things. This started before Xi Jinping, by the way. Xi Jinping's predecessor, Hu Jintao, has already started addressing how to alleviate rural poverty. And one thing they did was to get rid of the millennium old taxes on the farmers. Before the farmers they have to um, send a portion of their farm produce. They're mandated to sell it to the state, right? And during during 1950s all throughout 1970s, they had to give up all their produce to the state for state to redistribute. Um, but by after the first market reform in 1978, the farmers were allowed to retain a large portion of their produce, but they still have to pay a portion of their produce as taxes. But by 20 before the 2010s, around 2008, the farmers no longer have to pay a portion of their agricultural produce to the state, because at that time China was making enough money that it no longer needs to allocate the resources from the rural side to support the industry in the cities, but they could actually do it vice versa. They can actually one of the policy they for example, for a lot of more remote regions in China, more inland provinces like in Tibet or Xinjiang or even Sichuan, they will pair cities with coastal cities. They will pair Shanghai with a city in Tibet, for example. And then that Shanghai will be responsible for to provide some of the government's infrastructure in the city they sponsor. This is the way they kind of redirect the wealth away from the coastal area to the inland, and on top of that, they reduce the tax burden on the farmers. Those policy already started before Xi Jinping even came to power. When Xi Jinping did come to power, he continued that policy, right? And one of the things he focused on is poverty alleviation. And as we well, probably your audience will know, uh, China had managed to lift 800 million people out of absolute poverty by 2020. And that's actually a pretty big thing, because Xi Jinping himself, he spent his formative years as a quote unquote send down youth during Cultural Revolution to live in the countryside. So he is pretty well aware what the rural conditions were, and the idea is now the Chinese coastal areas are getting rich and getting wealthy. Now it's time to bring the rest of the country to the same level of development. So this also the same logic also goes into investment in public infrastructure. For example, high-speed railways, right? A lot of the Wall Street Journal, Western media reporting on Chinese high-speed rail development is like, oh, it's not profitable. This is like a misallocation of capital. They're not getting the return on investment. But the infrastructure is a public goods. It's not supposed to turn a profit. And one of the idea of building, for example, high speed rail from Shanghai to inland is so some of the wealth can be spread around now. And but it also brings it's a boost to economic activity. Now people can whereas before, a lot of migrant farmers, they have to leave their homes, for years sometimes, to work in big cities. Now they can go home in like in matter of hours, and many of them now choose to go back to live in their hometown, to build houses, and that brings additional economic boost to the inland provinces. And that is the idea, that the idea of building high speed rail is not wealth. It's not for the purpose of wealth extraction, right? Because that's a way how the Western financial type understand it. Everything is rent seeking. Everything is rent. You have to be. Everything has to be wealth extraction. But that's not what infrastructure project is supposed to be. So I may have like ramble on for a bit. So go ahead, ask me any questions.
So, okay, I definitely have a couple of follow-ups. I mean, but I did want to ask this other question, which is on sort of the US China situation and sort of preparing for war with China. Uh we have about 10 minutes left. So you know what? Maybe I will ask getting jumbled here. I'll ask a follow-up and I'll combine it with this, and then you can decide how you
Okay.
want to answer it. So Okay, so so you're saying essentially that this is in line with, the long trajectory of Chinese development, taking a long perspective of it. My question though is that, when Xi Jinping came to power, between that 2012, 2013, 2014 period, there were also a lot of, sort of anti-corruption drives and campaigns, which, many see as necessary. So I assume in that case, um, that obviously the party is not monolithic, but there would have been challenges to this kind of more state oversight of capital, kind of direction going on. So, to what extent, I guess my question is, to what extent is it, just a natural, long process of Chinese industrialization that now we can retrospectively look back on and sort of make that kind of determination? And, how much of it came from, I guess struggle within the party, if you can speak to that a little bit, to, whatever knowledge you have of that. And then, I'll throw in my other question here is, you know, the US in its own documents talks about war with China, in either 2025 or 2027. We see, it's bogged down in West Asia, with the crisis in Gaza and in the region. We had the Trump Putin summit in Alaska, where, Trump was seeming to be going hard, maybe we can say, behind Ukraine, punishing India and China for, for all this against Russia. But now maybe it's seeming like it's shifting its strategic priorities to maybe wind down, perhaps, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and shift to China. What are these, prospects for war with China? What is that looking like? I know you've noted that, as time goes on, the situation favors China. So, I'm sure if you and I are talking about this, those in the US officials are also very familiar with it. So, yeah, those two questions there.
Yeah. Okay, so introduction of market economy into China is not without its problems, right? And the in 19 I remember in the late 1980s, the party repeatedly warned about, what they call bourgeoisie liberalization. They warn about how the West always aim for peaceful revolution. This is actually a lead. This is a what would now be called color revolution, right? And when Jiang Zemin, in the third generation Chinese leader, uh, allowed Chinese businessmen to enter party, that was actually controversial at the time. It's like, what, you are letting capitalists into the party now? And but at that time, that was justified as like, okay, we're trying to it's a big tent party. We're trying to bring all the productive forces of the Chinese society under one tent. But that also led some excesses. There's a lot of corruption, no doubt, during kind of the freewheeling days of the early 2000s, when after China joined the WTO, when all these foreign capitals were coming in. And it got to the point where some party discipline was needed. This is why Xi Jinping had to do the anti-corruption drive, because there was a lot of corruption on all levels, and he had to make sure to ensure the party discipline, so it doesn't get to a situation where, like United States, where capital dictate the politics, not the other way around. Because in China, it's still very much the party is dictating the policy, not the capital. So people like Jack Ma cannot try to influence policy, right? Like I remember, for a more concrete example, was when Obama was speaking to Steve Jobs, ask him, okay, can we bring some, maybe making iPhones in the United States? And Steve Jobs just flat told no, no, not gonna happen. Sorry, can't do that. I can't have enough skilled labor in U.S. Blah blah blah. But Can you even imagine the similar type of conversation between Xi Jinping and Jack Ma? You can't, because that just won't happen. If Xi Jinping asks Jack Ma, okay, how about let's make sure or more get more domestic suppliers for Alibaba. Jack Ma will be like, okay, yes sir, I'll look into it. What can be done. But Obama, supposedly the leader of the free world, you know, Steve Jobs just tell him no. No, and there's nothing Obama could do about it. Now, some people say, "Oh, that's the strength of U.S. democracy," like. But the problem is, right, that we know how the system works in U.S. It's a government of the oligarchs, by the oligarchs, for the oligarchs, and this is why we're now it's even more obvious now. We have basically tech bros and finance bro capture of White House, and that does not happen in China. China's still very the Chinese government still very firmly in control of the capitalist class in China. They don't make sure they don't overstep the bounds, and this is why um yeah, okay, so that's one difference, and this is also one of the kind of ideological difference between China and the United States, right? And I think by the U.S. kind of gearing up for confrontation with China is both ideological and also um, it's basically this is the U.S. is trying to preserve its hegemonic status, its global hegemon status. It sees China as a threat, near peer competitor that threatened to dethrone United States. Because for a lot, when the U.S. multinationals rushed to China to invest back in 2000, their goal was for China to remain this vast, giant pool of cheap labor where they can continue to do the labor arbitrage. What they did not expect to see is it incubated a lot of their Chinese competitors are now globally competitive. That's why when Huawei was starting to take market share away from Apple, that led to U.S. coming very hard on Huawei, trying to kill off. Essentially, they brought all those political capital, trying to kill Huawei's cell phone business, right? And they almost succeeded. But they're facing a challenge, like a quite unprecedented challenge, because China just don't simply do well in one area. Now they're doing well in multiple fronts, in AI, in robotics. They're all challenging the U.S. Tech dominance, and that part is unacceptable. Now, it was acceptable for Chinese to make shoes and cheap toys and even assembly iPhone, but it's not cool that China now is selling EVs, exporting EVs all over the world. When Huawei is threatening to dethrone Apple, or when Huawei is building 5G networks all around the world. And so this is why U.S. work really hard to try to kill Huawei's 5G business overseas, and then try to kill Huawei's phone business, because Huawei is one of the Chinese company that represents that actually plow a lot of money into innovation. And the common refrain again is Chinese don't innovate. In fact, because China has innovated so much lately, that U.S. felt China is now a threat, and that this is why they're trying to come down really hard, trying to stop China's progress. This is the whole reason behind the semiconductor wars, when U.S. trying to limit the chip export to China, because they thought that would be the way to cripple China's AI development. But that didn't happen, because DeepSeek still happened, and so this is why U.S. is trying to gear up for confrontation against China. So from China's perspective, China's goal has never been to replace United States as a global hegemon. But China's focus has always been inward. It's trying to focus on develop China itself, and it continually to do that. And And now it has industrialized to the point where it is a manufacturing superpower, much more so than United States, because U.S. has been continually hollowing out its industrial base for the last 40 years. So China is sitting pretty. This is why I say China has time on its side. The longer China waits, the power differential between China and United States will continue to grow in China's favor. So China is not taking a bait. China is not taking. U.S. is trying to bait China into a conflict in Western Pacific, and China is very careful to avoid to taking that bait because there's no point to start a conflict in 2025 when China will be much more powerful in 2030. So China is trying to at least postpone the conflict as long as possible, and and I think so far, China has done that very successfully. Now, United States has been talking about pivoting to China since Obama administration. This is when Hillary Clinton was a state secretary of state, when she coined the term pivot to Asia. When she talks about pivot to Asia, she's not talking about pivoting investment into Asia. She's talking about pivoting military hardware and military deployment to Asia. But that hasn't happened because the U.S. empire has an inertia. All these institutions that build for maintenance of empire, they have an inertia of their own, and it has dragged the United States into a proxy war in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine against Russia. It's now embroiled in the West Asia, by U.S. sponsored Israeli aggression atrocities against Gaza and its neighbors. So pivot to Asia still hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it's going to happen because the U.S. empire is such an unwieldy beast, and now we have Donald Trump, and I like to say Trump is my president. Is my president for accelerationism of the U.S. imperial decline. And now I'll leave that as my concluding remark.
Of course, that's a good place to leave it. Thank you, Carl. Really appreciate your time.